Chapter 9. At 25 years of age, theosophy attracted my attention. Its smooth and logical theories pleased my reason, as did the impeccable style of Mrs. Annie Besant and Mr. Ledbetter. For some time I corresponded with both. Then the honesty and idealism of the first president of the Theosophical Society, Colonel Olcott, and the mysterious and powerful personality of Madame Blavatsky could not be disregarded. Apart from theories, there were also hints for developing the superphysical faculties latent in us. I began practicing concentration and meditation according to the then newly published book by a Mr. Ernest Wood. After some years of rather fruitless efforts, my enthusiasm began to diminish. The exercises mentioned did not prove very effective. Among theosophists, I could not find men who really knew and I could give me advice apart from printed books. Their masters were not accessible and seemed to be rather like a myth. It appeared that only Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott had had the privilege of meeting them in physical form. On my inquiry late in 1926, Mrs. Besant wrote to me, "It is true that after the death of Colonel Olcott in 1907, the masters withdrew their direct guidance of the Theosophical Society, but recently, in 1925, they resumed that guidance." At first, the development of the superphysical faculties was interesting. It excited my curiosity. Afterwards, I found that being based on the changing physical being, they were subject to the currents of the mind, and so were a blind alley, way from the supreme goal. Then came studies in Hermeticism, which is based on an ancient Egyptian tradition and uses the symbolism of the tarot as one of its main features. Being mathematically minded, the relationship and connection between numbers and the tarot cards engaged my attention. Eliphas Levi and Dr. Pappas temporarily became my intellectual masters. I became engrossed in a cumbersome process of creating new thoughts and ideas by working with a pack of tarot cards. I held meetings in public with the members of the different occult societies. It delighted me to see the attentive faces of my applause. In the audience, I saw a friend, a retired general. He was then president of a metaphysical society and a most kind listener, apparently following my conceptions and calculations with the help of drawings on a large blackboard behind my chair. Then another step. The next meeting was devoted to the ancient Abala. When I had finished, the blackboard was covered with Hebrew letters, mystical triangles and drawings. The lecture ended in loud-hearted laughter. He said to me afterwards, "Your lectures are very interesting, and the hall is always full. The fact that the public obviously does not understand even 10% of the matter is apparently no hindrance to the success of the exposition." These words gave me much food for thought, and as a result, I stopped public lecturing. I realized that 99% of the people came only to hear about something mysterious, for which they hoped to add some savior to their lives. My activities with the Hermetic occultism came to an end after performing a magic ritual as laid down by Eliphas Levi and Dr. Pappas. The three of us prepared ourselves for 21 days. For the operation, we chose a tower of an almost ruined castle in a remote area. The results were poor in proportion to the labor and time sacrificed. We succeeded, it is true, in obtaining some apparitions, spiritual elements in the smoke of incense and of special dried plants. Also some audible phenomena and effects of perfume. But overall, I was disappointed. The results could not possibly be tested scientifically and gave no ground for definitive conclusions. Even the very impressions received appeared different to each of us. Gradually, I gave up the whole business of ceremonial magic. My next study was of a very interesting book by Dr. Brandler Procht, a German occultist. His method was definite and clear. He recommended many valuable exercises leading to the control of thoughts and in the consequence of the whole personality. Their aim was the acquiring of power and ability to concentrate the mind upon only one thing without deviation or gap, to deliberately stop the whole process of thinking for 10 minutes at a time. There were, of course, many other instructions which cannot be described here. Strangely enough, he expected one to reach the grade of young master in about 6 months. However, I spent much more time than in order to obtain both kinds of concentration, leading up to only 3 minutes. The period of Hermeticism, magic, and Dr. Brandler Procht was behind me. I visited France. In Paris was the headquarters of the Association of Spiritual Friendships, founded by Paul Sadhu, for 20 years well known as an occultist and mystic. His most mysterious book, The Initiations, made a good impression on me. He wrote plainly about his master and later about his direct experiences with the so-called Master of Masters, the very name of whom he never dared to pronounce. This organization, being semi-secret, advocated the most elevated and pure ideas that I then knew. But at the time, in 1935, Paul Sadhu had been dead for 13 years. I therefore sought the great master described by him, but was unable to meet him. Eventually, I found some old members who knew Sadhu and who could possibly show me the path. It was a hard task, for the Western masters purposefully use a policy different from their Eastern brothers. They prefer to be and remain completely unknown to all except their true disciples, and their inviolable standards are very high. It is extremely difficult to be allowed into the presence of these great beings, and the silence of secrecy must be sworn and observed for life. I cannot therefore say anything more. There was one early experience which may be worth describing. Living in our town was a bishop whom people described as a saint. He was a true ascetic. People of all creeds came to him to ask his blessings, which was said to be very effective. I had to leave my university studies and enlist for that during the First World War when I was 19. My mother was a keen theosophist and had fine religious feelings, but as was natural at my age, I was concerned only with sport and study. And one day my mother said to me, "My son, you are going to the war. I do not know if the Almighty will grant me grace to see you again. Tomorrow I want to take you to our saintly bishop. He will give you his holy blessing." Reluctant as I was, I could not refuse my mother's wish, so the next afternoon, a priest took us into a modest room with only a few wooden chairs and a crucifix on the wall. The bishop entered. I saw a thin man in his 40s in the simple dress of a monk. His hands were joined on his breast, and his head was somewhat bent. The strange wax-like complexion of the thin face was framed by a long hair falling to the shoulders. The hair was darkly black, and when he came closer, I could see his eyes, dark and filled with strange, soft light. They were so different from those of any other human being that I was struck by their mysterious expression of peace, power, and wisdom. Fortunately, I refrained from making any conventional greeting. It seemed as if I could not speak. But the bishop smiled gently and said in a low voice, "It is good, young man, that you came here." Then he raised his hands over my head and made a broad sign of the cross. I spontaneously kissed his meager hand. That was all. Leaving the room, I could hear the words spoken to my mother, who was still before him. "Go in peace. Everything will be well with the boy." And I remembered this moment again when I sat at the feet of Maharshi for the first time, soon after my arrival at the ashram. Also, I remembered as in a dream that the Christian name of the bishop was the same as that of the unknown master whom I had tried to meet in Paris years later. Soon after my visit to France, my family, and later the Second World War, brought me to a period of darkness. I forgot all my previous endeavors. Not earlier than the spring of 1945, an elderly lady with whom I sometimes spoke of theosophy lent me Paul Brunton's A Search in Secret India. She literally forced me to take the book, for I was by no means eager to read it. But the last 2 chapters, where the author describes his visit to Maharshi, were decisive. At last I found my true master. This certainly came of itself and permitted no doubts. And when I realized why all my previous searching had been in vain, the occult ways mentioned before were only blind alleys. They could give me some help, but there was no vision of the true goal. Therefore, of necessity, they were unsuccessful. Their exercises, concentrations, and breath controls absorbed only time and energy. They veiled the aim which I could not see in their shadows. On the path given by the great Rishi, the Maharshi, the goal is visible from the first step. It is spiritualization of man. The power of the Spirit is unlimited. Now it was clear to me why the vichara, the self-inquiry, could replace the time-devouring training of occult practices. All that I had previously been striving after, concentration, meditation, breath and body control, a clear vision of reality, peace and bliss, all of them now came of their own accord as ripe fruit falls from a tree. Then I began to work with self-inquiry, as described later in chapter 14. The first steps are always the most difficult. Now I can laugh over these difficulties encountered when entering the direct path, but then it was almost an inner ordeal. And little wonder, for the whole inner world of a man must be changed and his mind subdued. The tragedy was that I knew that it must be done, but did not then know to whom my former lord, the mind, had to capitulate. There was emptiness in me when I tried to exclude the thinking process from consciousness. This emptiness was not pleasant, and it even brought some fear. The feeling was similar to that of a mountaineer who, on entering higher regions, feels that there is not enough air to breathe and that he is suffocating. So I decided that I needed better conditions and more opportunity for meditation and self-inquiry. I knew long before that if we think strongly for some days about a certain thing, at a certain time we find that our thoughts return to it at the same hour and even minute. This helps to make our meditation easier and more effective and spares us much effort. I decided to use this means and at the same time to find more congenial conditions for study. A friend in Paris, a Roman Catholic priest, a well-educated and elderly man with whom I sometimes corresponded, knew of my endeavors, without in any way attempting to dissuade me from them. I wrote to him saying that I wanted to find a place in which to live for some months, where quiet meditation would be possible. He kindly recommended his own monastery. Anyone, he said, who is a Roman Catholic and feels a need for spiritual concentration can go there for a time, take part in the simple life of its inmates, and profit according to his own inner capacity. Intuitively, I felt that this was what I was seeking. In a few weeks, I had arranged my affairs, was being ushered into the presence of the prior and accepted as a temporary resident. There were no obligations on my side, and I told him frankly that I contemplated leaving Europe in a few months for a country in the southern hemisphere. But I was told that the Father N, my friend, had already given all particulars about myself and that everything was in order. I was given a pleasant room in the vast building, which was a monastery in the heart of Paris. Another priest visited me and asked what books I would like to read. Very gently, he suggested a study of The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. He was immensely pleased when I told him that it was the very book for which I would have asked. Incidentally, he had it with him in the pocket of his cassock. During the first weeks, I was left completely alone. According to my plan, I entered into the simple life of the monastery and found it appropriate for my aims. In the morning before breakfast, I went to the gallery on the first floor of the chapel. It ran around the interior of the church, and there were chairs and many small altars where priests said masses every morning. Later, I began to visit this quiet and peaceful place whenever I wished to meditate. After breakfast, I studied in my room whatever I had as a special program for the day. After lunch, I sometimes went for a walk, visiting numerous famous places in the city. In addition, I tried to train my mind to rule it in the midst of the feverish life of this large city. And an explanation of the method used will be found in Chapter 14 on self-inquiry. Sometimes, as dawn broke, I would still be sitting in my chair in the half-dark gallery of the chapel, merged in meditation. One of the priests, a member of the monastery staff, seeing me sitting for long hours without movement, once visited me in my room and asked if such long and obviously intense meditations might not impair my health. "Our body is a fragile instrument," said the good old man, "and if we injure it, our capacity to serve the Lord is diminished." Of course, I assured him that I knew what I was doing and how much my body could stand, but thanked him sincerely for his concern on my behalf. I visited all the various departments of this great community, which is separated from the outside world by high walls. I spoke with cooks and servants, with gardeners and tailors. All were brothers of the order, and everyone had his work. In the morning, they assisted the priests at Mass, and during the day, interrupted their labors at fixed times for short prayers. They were mostly simple men, devout and friendly, and had spent their lives since youth there. Sometimes they were transferred to other monasteries in the country. They accepted everything without question. Then I understood the meaning of renunciation of one's own will and its place in spiritual progress. It was but another form of extinguishing the old enemy, the so-called ego. This form and method is the best for simple and less educated people, from whose ranks come most of the brothers of these Catholic religious orders. When I asked them which they preferred, prayers or work for the community, they told me simply that their work was only another form of prayer. 3 years later, when in India, I was given a pamphlet written by a famous Indian saint and yogi, a highly educated man who has his own ashram in the Himalayas. The title was, "Work is Worship. Dedicate it to God." Now I could understand the unseen ties that bind all humans striving for the highest. It dawned on me here, in one of the spiritual centers of the West, why I felt no disharmony in following a path based on Eastern methods, in a temple consecrated to another great teacher, Jesus Christ, for whom I had always felt the deepest admiration and love. About this time, I came in contact with the head of the Ramakrishna mission in Paris. The eminent Swami, whom the ashram of Sri Maharshi had recommended me to visit. He was always very busy, but when he was shown my letter from Tiruvannamalai, he immediately gave me an interview. During our talk, he said, "Sri Maharshi is your spiritual master, your guru. Ask him for help. It will be granted to you." Also, pointing to the way out of some other inner difficulties, I had confessed to him, and he gave me a short mantra which would put me in touch with the great Rishi, whom of course I had not yet seen. It was the repetition of Om Ramana Om. Months passed and my self-inquiry was firmly established, but it was not yet the living, vital vichara, or self-inquiry from the transforming of the whole man, which it later became in South America, some years after being with the Maharshi. But even this had no comparison with the light which illumined it when I was in the presence of the Master, the Maharshi himself. And so I say that the great being who gave us this wonderful tool in a form appropriate to our epoch, self-inquiry, and becomes our beloved Master and Lord of our lives, he has already merged in the infinite ocean of life, which is the universal reality, the spirit and pure being. What else could be the ultimate destiny of us all, of you and me, who are really rivulets seeking the same ocean, our eternal home of bliss?